Hi, and welcome to Imperfect Utopias, based out of the UCL Global Governance Institute. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favourite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance. It's a real pleasure to have Mary Lawlor here with us today. Mary has a long and distinguished career at the coalface of human rights advocacy. It's a particular pleasure for me, as Mary has been an inspiration in my own research on human rights and was an early collaborator when I was a fresh young lecturer at Trinity College Dublin. Mary is the founder of Frontline Defenders, the leading human rights organisation in Ireland, which focuses on meeting the immediate security needs of human rights defenders at risk around the world. The ethos of that organisation reflects Mary's own philosophy, which has always placed defenders, those brave individuals placing themselves in harm's way for their rights, the rights of others, at the heart of any strategy to build a more peaceful and just society. She said that the informal DNA of Frontline Defenders was to be fast, flexible, and furious in amplifying the voice of defenders, and without doubt, they need support. These are dangerous times to be speaking out on human rights, with hundreds of human rights defenders killed in 2019, regimes of both democratic and authoritarian stripes increasingly brazen in attacking civil liberties and protections. In recognition of her work in the field, Mary has recently been appointed UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Just as the world has been engulfed in a major pandemic, she's very clear that COVID-19, the situation and the response to it, poses an immediate threat to human rights defenders, as well as highlighting a health rights crisis and the erosion of hard-won human rights protections around the world. In her words, it is in all our interest to protect the right to defend rights. And we can't take that for granted, it seems, in this time. So we have to find new ways of defending rights in a rapidly changing world order, and we have to do it quickly. We have to learn quickly, given a looming climate crisis and related risks. So lots to talk about, Mary. Perhaps I could just begin by asking you to map out some of the major issues that are on your plate at the moment, confronting human rights defenders in July 2020. I imagine some of those challenges are long-standing challenges, and others, of course, like COVID-19, novel and very new.
Yes, well, funnily enough, I've already done my report for the General Assembly, because they need about 4 or 5 months, and I had to do it within a month of being in the job. So I had to think very fast about what my priorities were and are. But that was helped by the fact that, I've been around human rights defenders for a very long time, and I know their situation. So the kind of things that I am going to concentrate on are, first of all, COVID-19 and the impact on human rights defenders on COVID, because you can't ignore it. Human rights defenders who are the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, and in particular, the ones working in very remote areas. Often these are Indigenous and land and environmental rights defenders. So that will be a focus along with other vulnerable groups like women, LGBTI, disability rights defenders. And lately, we've just been starting to talk about children as human rights defenders, particularly as climate justice and climate action has become such a big looming threat. And then, of course, there's the old stalwarts like long-term prisoners and killings of human rights defenders, two things that I feel very strongly about. And then, of course, linked to killings and linked to Indigenous and land and environment are business and human rights. So they're all interconnected there. And reprisals against defenders who cooperate with the UN. So they're the kind of things, but I'm also particularly interested in when we're talking about killings and business and human rights and land environmental and all of that kind of stuff, in tracing how a threat develops into a killing, because in 85% of the cases of people who've been killed, it has been preceded by a threat. And in 75% of cases, there has been a physical attack. And this offline and online kind of attack sets human rights defenders up to be attacked and creates an environment where it's okay for them to be attacked. And then eventually they're killed. And certainly frontline defenders, they documented over about 304 defenders last year who were murdered, and 13% of them were women, and 40% of them were land, environmental and indigenous people. So that's really what I'm doing now at the moment.
I mean, yeah, it's quite a lot on your plate. I mean, it must sometimes seem a little bit overwhelming that you have so many different constituencies, of course, who need protection, who need assistance. To what extent do you feel that there's some consensus in the human rights movement around what the biggest challenges, what the principal focus in terms of strategy to assist these people should actually be?
Well, I think at the moment everyone is talking about COVID. I mean, even tomorrow I'm doing a webinar with special mandates on freedom of expression and freedom of association. But it's not just us. It's everyone is talking about COVID. And how can you not talk about it? I mean, it has been an unseen, invisible enemy. And not that I'm looking on the bright side of it or anything, but it did show how it can affect even the most powerful people, and that populist or corrupt governments cannot control it just by stamping down their big bully feet. And but it has created more challenges. So, for example, we've been talking to defenders every day online pretty much since April, once I basically was told I was getting the job, I started talking to human rights defenders from the 5 regions. And of course, they're all now having to work exclusively online, and that can have security implications for them because people know where they are. They know that they're not out and about, that they're stuck inside. And so they're more vulnerable than they would be if they were going outside. And women human rights defenders, particularly in patriarchal countries where often the threats come from within their own family and community, are more at risk during this time. And then there's death threats. Ruth Mumby in Kenya, for example, she's a woman who works normally in informal settlements for the rights of women. And there was an eviction in Nairobi of all these women, an illegal eviction. And Ruth decided she would gather some money for food and basic supplies for them. And as a result, she got death threats from the police. And despite the government saying it would stop evictions, these women were still evicted. And then there's laws everywhere. Cambodia has brought in laws. There's no you're not allowed any online stuff, and also, there's obviously no meetings are allowed now. Obviously, with the pandemic, you need a lot of this stuff. But then there's Russia that has the biggest camera surveillance with facial recognition, more of it brought in. Israel, who started cooperating with the NSO agency, which has been supplying malware to governments for surveillance for a long time. These are the kind of things that are happening. And many human rights defenders have shifted from advocacy to humanitarian, to supplying food and medicine within their communities. And some of them are still struggling to work online. And then in some countries, of course, it's very expensive to buy data. So, for example, in Ethiopia. And of course, internet connections are not good in many countries, including my own. And for example, yesterday I was talking we were talking to defenders from working on extractive industry, and there was, the internet was going in and out. There were dogs barking. There were people hammering. So it can be very difficult. And one of the things that shocked me was that these defenders were saying that they're being staked out by illegal loggers and settlers of extractive people wanting to, come in and appropriate their land for something, because they know they're unable to protest, they're unable to do anything. So it has that kind of effect. And then in the Amazon particularly, a lot of the defenders have got COVID, so they're already weakened, so their lands are being taken over as well. And of course, then there's the economic situation for defenders. They don't know if they're going to be able to continue to get funds to do their work. And medics, like, the terrible thing about medics in countries like Egypt and Russia, they've been punished for speaking out against the virus, as have journalists, as you know. So, and then, of course, there's the prisoners. All the human rights defenders who are in jail. Azimjan Askarov, his last appeal to the Supreme Court has been denied.
Which country was that in, Mary?
That was in Kyrgyzstan.
Right.
And that happened, and he's quite elderly and frail. He's been in prison since 2012. And then there's, for example, in Iran, there's 3 women, Nasrin Sotoudeh, Etima Diami. Etima Diami was supposed to be released just the 4th, which I think was last Saturday, after serving 5 years. But they brought her to court and put another 2 years on her sentence. One was for disrupting prison order, and 1 year, and the other was a kind of enemy of the state stuff. So she's just got another 2 years. And Narj Mohammadi, who has a very long prison sentence, is also there. So, there's so many issues that arise solely from COVID, or maybe not always solely from COVID, but exacerbated by.
I think it's characteristic of your work and your approach that you're very close to the ground, and that you are seeking to reach out and to be present with these people's situations in all sorts of different countries. And I wonder whether, COVID has obviously dominated now the agenda, but it seems as if it is really accelerating what were already quite serious acute human rights issues in these settings. And I do wonder to what extent, we often talk about shrinking space for civil society, for human rights defenders, as if the 1990s were some kind of halcyon age, if you will. In your view, to what extent do we see an acceleration or sort of continuity of human rights pushback, and perhaps quite sophisticated attempts to repress human rights advocacy? Or do we actually see something new emerging when it comes to the sort of threat environment that's faced by human rights defenders?
Well, it's always very difficult to be categoric about this, because on the one hand, we've been seeing the shrinking space for many years now. I think there's about 84 countries that have brought in laws. You probably know better than I do, but I know, that, what is it, ICNL, isn't that they're tracking it with the Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism. They have a project, great website for any of your students. So you can see how these laws have been brought in to neutralize and prevent human rights defenders from carrying out their legitimate work. And in your introduction, you said the right to defend human rights. And that's a message that I think we have to keep really, plugging, that everyone has a legitimate right to defend human rights. So, if you were to ask me, you see, I started in the 70s, and like in the 70s, there was no internet. Everything was written. And I remember in an urgent case, I was with Amnesty International at the time. There was one fax machine in Dublin that an Amnesty member had, and there were more than one, but there were, fax machines had just come in. And the only person in Amnesty that we knew was a solicitor who had a fax machine. So I'd race over into his office, and send a fax. And it was like, nowadays you have such advantages. I know there are terrible disadvantages, but there are great advantages to the internet and to the speed at which information can be shared. Or I'm not talking about fake information, but I always remember with Justina Makoko, a woman in Zimbabwe who was disappeared, and it was the Zim lawyers for human rights that were working on her case. And in those days, I was in Amnesty. This was about 30 years ago. And in those days, you'd be trying to ring up to find out what's going on, and the lawyers would be busy, and they wouldn't want to be talking to people all over the world asking them what's going on, and you'd be trying to follow the information. And then when Facebook came in, they set up a page, because this woman she was often, a threat. And they set up a page. Sorry, the first time she hadn't been disappeared, but the second time when Facebook was up and running, they set up a page, and it was great. They just posted stuff on the page, and you could see it immediately. And that's a great tool for human rights work. And there are more and more people involved in human rights work now than there ever were before. But if you were to look back at the 70s, the place was surrounded by dictatorships, you had all the generals running Latin America. You had a dictatorship in Indonesia. You had apartheid in South Africa. The Soviet Union, had controlled most of Eastern Europe and beyond. So, it was really bad then too, and yes, gains were made. Probably there was a short window, but their violations are always with us and will always be with us, I think, and so I wouldn't think that it's insurmountable at all.
I mean, maybe that historical perspective brings home just how high the stakes are, though. How important it is to fight the battles, to hold the line, and to try and prevent backsliding in terms of civil liberties and human rights protections. And a lot of analysts are now talking about, a new Cold War 2.0, a retreat into nationalist populism, a liberal politics, and clearly that is potentially very serious for human rights protections.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one doesn't like to be rude about some of the populist presidents that we have around the place. And of course, they're all learning from each other as well. And each one seems to encourage the other. And there is a retreat. There's no doubt about that. But Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, he said we were put on in this world to improve civilization. And my friend Frank Jennings, who sadly died of a brain tumor, one of my best friends and mentors, he said I always remember him saying to me, Mary, we have to choose civilization every day. And there are really, there are more good people than bad people in the world. So, it's not all bleak and hopeless. And I suppose the thing is, we have to, as you say, fight to arrest this kind of slide back against international standards by reminding governments that they have agreed to, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the covenants, all of that kind of stuff, and they have international obligations they freely accepted. Now, how they choose to exercise those international obligations, of course, is a different matter. It seems to me that it's a kind of it's all very well. You can be very. I always get amused when a government that is not perfect points the finger at another government, and it's almost like, you know, and they're quite genuine in it. But when it comes to their own stuff, they can't take it, and they don't. It's not as if they're not thick-skinned. Governments know they're not perfect. They know there's an awful lot they are doing wrong. They know they should be improving. They know they should be sticking to international standards. They know that they have said they accept, international standards and have ratified many international standards. But their idea of implementing them, when it suits them, because of their political and strategic interests, they don't.
And on that note of holding governments to account, of course, you now find yourself being a sort of insider outsider within the UN system.
Yeah.
Kofi Annan has described the UN Special Rapporteurs as the crown jewels of the human rights regime. And I'd be curious to know, did you have a good sense of what the role would entail before being appointed? And how have you found it? How are you approaching the task of, strategizing as well as outreach to government, as well as obviously not giving up on basic principles?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult at the moment because there's no meetings and, everything is online. But for example, and I think this is the third time in my life I've had to reinvent myself, because the first one I think was, when I joined Amnesty as a director, or as chairperson it was in those days, because we didn't have a paid staff for several years, and so it was completely voluntary when I joined. And then I got money, so we got an office and started to build Amnesty in Ireland and all of that. And then so then you were part of a big institution. Like Amnesty is a big institution and quite bureaucratic in its ways. So you had to work within the framework of that institution. And I remember getting into trouble the odd time. And then I left to set up Frontline, and I realized that you really had to change your mindset completely, because if human rights defenders are in danger, you can't be hanging around forever, writing a letter and hoping something good happens. You have to act very quickly and in a flexible way. So then anyway, so now I'm Special Rapporteur, and that is completely different again. It has elements of, I suppose, the institutionality of Amnesty International in the old days. It's probably changed much more now. And it has nothing of Frontline, because Frontline is a very fast, flexible organization. The UN is beset by rules, by procedures, by what you're allowed to do, by what you're not allowed to do. So I am trying to learn how to navigate the system. The UN system is really it's really difficult as far as I'm concerned, and I'm trying to work out what is the added value that I can bring as Special Rapporteur. And I think the added value that I can bring is the increased access to governments, that perhaps I'll be able to make small differences to human rights defenders. And I'm also bringing an activist approach and a people-centered approach to the mandate. So I don't know how I'm going to get on. And it's quite, it can be quite daunting. For example, Costa Rica, which is a country that isn't bad at all. The ambassador of Costa Rica asked me lately to change a press release I'd written, in which the word impunity was used. And I read the press release and I decided I'd take out a quote that had impunity in it, because I had said pattern of impunity, and I thought that wasn't fair. And but I left it in the headline of the press release. But she rang me to ask me to do this. So these are the kind of pushbacks you're getting, from states. And she was very nice about it. She made it clear she wasn't trying to interfere with the independence of the mandate, but she wanted basically to give me information about what the government was doing. And that is, I think, the role. If you can bring the concerns of human rights defenders to governments, and you can get them to put in place something a bit better than they have to help protect these human rights defenders, well, that's the most you can hope for. But the UN as a protection agency would, it's not set up, it's not designed to be like that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how many government officials were ringing you up at Frontline Defenders to complain about annual reports or to seek to inform your views. I guess that is quite a contrast.
Nobody. You did all the running in Frontline to governments, but really there were only, you just wrote off to your oppressive government about whatever case it was, or your European Union about, whatever it was, that you'd like them as the EEAS delegations to take action. But it was always very at a distance, apart from the ones you knew, like the ones that have human rights defenders as a priority, like Ireland and Norway and a few like that. But here, like, I'm hoping that, and of course in Geneva you would meet some ambassadors that they would speak to you. I used to go into the council and I would go up to them where they were sitting and ask them, could I have a word with them? And you see, they're very well trained and they're very polite, so they'll always say yes. And certainly, I always remember I was very proud. The Iranians introduced me to the Chinese and told them that they should talk to me because I was a good woman.
That's quite the recommendation.
That was funny.
When we look at the UN, it seems as if the sort of global Samaritans, the Costa Ricas, the Norways, are a bit of a dwindling community, and there's a lot more ambivalence, if you will, among countries who previously were really sort of important reference points for human rights. I think defenders and protections within the UN system. I wonder whether, for some that's been a bit of a shock, that sort of the 1990s, more benign sort of beacons of human rights, and we could think of a number of very powerful countries that perhaps have shifted away from that position in recent years. But given your experience working with human rights defenders in unstable, dangerous contexts, having to try and appeal to political leaders who perhaps would rather just not know about human rights violations or just don't care about them, I wonder whether that does give you a little bit more insight into how to apply pressure in this more challenging context.
I am reminded of this wonderful Israeli human rights defender. He was Rabbis for Human Rights. I can't remember his name. But I remember, we were talking in Jerusalem, and he said to me, Mary, he said, in the old days, I was very strategic about everything. I would think it out. I would say, this is what I have to do, and I would do it. Now, he says, I just scatter everything and hope something kind of sticks. And, there's a lot to be said for that, because you never know. In my life, I've found you never know what will bring a small change. If you look at Ireland, for example, when I was director of Amnesty, we had the death penalty. We didn't have the ratification of the covenants. Until the 70s, there was a bar on married women, 73, a bar on married women. So they had to give up their jobs once they were married. They couldn't sit on juries. There was no access to contraception. Now we have equal marriage and we have access to reproductive rights. So things do move on. They can go back and I always think with Latin America, when all those dictators were there and bit by bit the countries became more democratic, obviously they are not, you couldn't call a lot of them proper democracies, but at least they're not full dictatorships, and you aren't having all those people in Argentina going missing, or bodies dropped over the sea, or the slaughter of Mayan villages, or that sort of thing. So, and the UN has withstood everything, despite all these political political challenges along the way, depending on whether it was the coal, depending on what it was. But they seem to have come through difficult times before, like they survived the Cold War, for example. And, it is difficult, but I think that all you can do is keep plugging away. You have to be resilient, and you have to be persistent, and you have to keep doing it.
As they say, if the UN didn't exist, someone would have to create it.
Exactly.
There's some truth to that. I think, as you're suggesting, it's important not to get too swept away by the current historical juncture, to put it into that kind of that longer sweep and have context. I think there's a lot of colleagues, and myself included, who are looking at the multilateral system and really seeing that it is creaking, particularly when it comes to providing these kinds of protections, human rights protections, other public goods such as, say, biodiversity preservation, climate change, and so on. And I mean, to the extent to which some of those transnational challenges perhaps exceed the potential of a system premised on nation-state governments, there might be I suppose, a new generation of challenges and risks which are going to require real innovation and a lot of hard thinking about how to galvanize decentralized, networked, transnational action that, in a way, I suppose, operates around the sort of multilateral system, but ultimately the multilateral system, I imagine, will remain an important part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the big multinationals, the big transnationals, they're more powerful than governments in many cases, and like even last week, I was talking to somebody. The local police were being paid off by the companies, So, and this is happening. We all know about the corruption link between business and governments and local officials and all that sort of thing. But again, even in that area, and I do think there has to be a twin track approach. I don't think there's much point in trying to reinvent the system. I think if you just stuck to what you had and did it and implemented, the rules about how people should behave, because they're there. Like, it's not as if they're not there, but they don't use. So, okay, you could spend an awful lot of time trying to think about, well, what will you come up with that'll make people behave better? And what would happen? In my view, you'd still be stuck with the implementation, because people, governments, I really truly believe, their political and strategic interests, and also, I'm afraid, that whole notion of power corrupting, we're not going to make saints out of these people, So, but with business and human rights, like, there are moves afoot. I mean, there is the draft UN Global Treaty on Business and Human Rights. I know that won't be for a long time, and even then, it won't probably be implemented. But there is a drive. There's 175 investors led by the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, which include asset managers and pensions and public funds and faith-based institutions. And these were representing $4.5 trillion. And they've sent a letter to all 95 major multinational companies calling for improved performance and disclosure on human rights due diligence. Like, that kind of thing is new and that's growing. This whole thing about ESG in investing is growing. On the other hand, like you saw, the European Commissioner is going to bring in mandatory human rights due diligence for the EU next 2021. So again, they're small steps, but they're important steps. And certainly in some of the Latin American countries, they are concerned about the rise of the influence of companies. And of course, China is eating up everywhere, and all these Canadian. Actually, in a couple of weeks, I've been asked to talk to 3 companies in Colombia. Glencore, which of course has a rotten record. I can't remember the other 2. I haven't done my research on it all yet. But this again is a sign that they feel they want to engage with you. They want to. What they say now. I know it's a lot of it is what I call. It's probably mean of me, but corporate social responsibility. They all love to play corporate social responsibility, but not business and human rights. And I think corporate social responsibility is all about PR and trying to make yourself look good in the community. Now, obviously, there are things that are very valuable, like when they get involved in the community and help with painting schools or giving healthcare to somebody or whatever. That's all good. But it's from the bottom down. It's not from the ground up. And the whole thing about business and human rights is it is from the ground up. It's putting the communities affected by whatever a company is doing at the center and insisting they have free, prior, informed participation, and that the stuff that's produced by the company is even in a language that they understand. But again, like 10 years ago, no company would have been wanting to talk to you about how can they improve their performance in Colombia.
Yeah, I mean, Colombia is one of the deadliest places in the world for human rights defenders. Yeah. And there is certainly a lot of conflict around extractive operations in that country and others in the region, of course. And the reticence of business to engage a human rights agenda, I imagine, might be because human rights invokes legal obligations. Although, of course, when it comes to, say, Pillar 3 of the guiding principles, Pillar 3 is often the kind of the right to remedy. That's the one that sort of falls through the cracks, often because of very dysfunctional judicial systems. So the problem is deeply rooted, and it does engage issues around essentially the domestic politics of justice and human rights. And the UN is, of course, can be quite a distant player in that political contest.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are a couple of things that come to mind there. I mean, the UN is definitely under threat because, there are so many big players who aren't paying their dues for a start. So it's completely bankrupt not completely bankrupt, but it's got severe budgetary issues. And you have a Secretary General at the moment who is in many ways afraid to speak out. And you have a High Commissioner for Human Rights who, in my view, was brought in more as a politician rather than Zaid, the previous High Commissioner for Human Rights, who was very outspoken. So you see this kind of this trend throughout the UN, and that is deeply worrying. There's no way around it.
And it's worrying perhaps also because it's quite easy for academics and others to retreat into questions of legal obligation when, for instance, in my recent research in the Philippines, I was struck by the amount of support that Rodrigo Duterte has in the general public.
Yeah.
And it's not really about human rights as legal claims. It's about having to engage in, robust political and moral argumentation to drive forward political struggles.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you read the report on the Philippines that OHCHR did was actually really great. Right down to the threats that human rights defenders were getting. We got a whole load of, we asked for them because we were in touch with Philippine defenders, but we also got the ones that were in the OHCHR report because they're very graphic and you can see them. And that man, I mean, it is extraordinary. These populist presidents, they seem to have tapped into something where they have the support of society. And this is, it's extraordinary that, for example, health workers, we were talking to health workers in the Philippines who were in danger because of their work. And he has them red tagged. He says they're all communists and they're enemies of the state. And, and he actually in one speech said that he was coming after human rights defenders. I can't remember the exact wording, whether he said they should be killed or not, but it was like a serious threat. And that kind of stuff, you do wonder when you talk about all of this. It seems to me that the legal framework, going back to what you were saying, putting everything in the legal framework isn't enough. You have to find creative ways, and I think I think we have to start with the children. I think we have to do really serious human rights education with children from the word go. I think we have to use the arts. I think we have to have different entry points into human rights, where people will understand that they're really talking about protecting the rights of the people they love and themselves.
And in a climate context, certainly placing children's rights at the heart of that agenda. What will the world look like in 2050 from a human rights perspective? How will that impact your children? Surely that you would imagine that would resonate.
Well, you would imagine, but so far, but I don't know. There seems to be a growing movement, as you know yourself, of young people and children who have adopted climate change as the issue that they're most concerned about, and certainly they are beginning to mobilize in different countries. For me, I've been asked about, the definition. Is it okay? Is it enough if they're just defending their own rights? But for me, it isn't. They have to be defending the rights of others. So, for example, one of the examples, I was on this child rights webinar the other week, an example that somebody asked me, like 3 schoolgirls going to the father of a friend of theirs that was going to be sold off as a child bride. Would they be human rights defenders? And I said, yes, they would be human rights defenders, particularly if they were harassed or intimidated by the father. But it's a very difficult. It's a loaded. Children as human rights defenders is tricky. At what stage? How do they have progressive autonomy? Are their parents, what is the role of parents in deciding what they should and shouldn't do? All that kind of stuff. It's very tricky. But back to the legal standards. I mean, if you talk about presenting human rights in a different way, I agree with you fully that we should get rid of the language, because I do think that is inaccessible to a lot of people. I've started I've started to talk about health workers, both doctors, nurses, porters, cleaners, anybody who has put themselves in danger during COVID as human rights defenders, in a way to, I suppose, show that people who are, because everyone loved the doctors and the nurses and the cleaners and the porters. Certainly in around Europe and North America, and also in Africa and Asia, you could see it. Actually, there were a group of 40 nurses were arrested for protesting in Uganda yesterday because they didn't have enough personal protective equipment. But you can see how the idea of, if you can make a link, I think anyway, if you can make a link between people that people look up to, as human rights defenders, and try and, I really don't know how you get rid of this support and the way these populist presidents manage to reach people by playing on their fears. I really don't know how you get that. We're working with Facebook at the moment about online threats, though, and trying to work out how we can stop, with Facebook's help, online threats. Well, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a really important focus for our students to perhaps keep in mind as to, well, these are frontier concerns for practitioners in the human rights field. I know you've got a pressing engagement, Mary, with a government delegation shortly, but I just want to perhaps finish with a question directed towards our student audience. I mean, what do you think a student needs to become a specialist in human rights today, and how can they best orientate themselves to understand the real challenges that are confronting human rights defenders? Or put it differently, what questions should they be asking?
Well, I mean, I'm afraid you're probably asking the wrong person, because I learned everything as I went along. I got into human rights kind of by default. Sean McBride, who was a barrister here, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the American Medal of Justice, and the Lenin Peace Prize. He was one of the founding members of Amnesty. I knew him, so it was kind of by default I got involved. And then, bit by bit, it drags you in, and you realize that you can do something. And the questions will come to you as you go along. There's a fantastic quote. Can I just get it, because I looked it up for my daughter. Here, I have to get it on this. I sent it to myself. There's a fantastic quote that I sent to my daughter today, because I wanted her to. I just wanted her to have it. I thought it would be good for her. Sorry.
We should put Seamus Haney in the show notes as well. He's got some poetry. Yeah.
Poet. But concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves through. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unseen incidents, meetings, and material assistance which no man could have dreamed would ever have become his way. And I think for a student, you don't get bogged down in, oh God, how do I work this out? How do I work that out? How will I apply this legal framework? How will I do that? Make the decision that you want to do something, and then learn as you go along. Get field, get country experience. Go and work with some people on the ground, if possible, just to get a feel for the daily lived reality of human rights defenders, rather than learning about it from textbooks and getting immersed in all the legal standards, which you still need to be able to apply, but bringing it down to a level where you can see what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. And I think that way it will just it'll become clear as they go along. And you don't have to know everything immediately. You just do learn it as you go along. There's a line in a Theodore Rothke poem, I learn by going where I have to go. And I think that's really all you can do, you know?
Well, I guess if we knew all the answers, you know, it wouldn't be such a mess, would it? So that sounds like good advice. You keep an open mind, keep learning.
Yeah.
Great. Well,
yeah, I suppose so.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary, for your time. Really appreciate it. I hope we'll get another chance to chat. Best wishes. Yeah. Good luck with the work, and yeah, we'll be following your work and what's going on. Thanks so much.
Thanks a million. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias. To get access to all of our content and to stay up to date with future Zoom calls, workshops, and events and more, check us out at ucl.ac.uk/global-governance. If you like this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. Until next time.